Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first of our official online lectures. We're giving it a shot here. We're making it work. The nice part about this whole action, if there is any nice part to this whole situation, is that we're starting a new unit. So we get to start fresh with all these videos. And we're going to be learning about syntax today. So I'm not going to do too much preamble. I'm going to jump right into some material here. Possibly, if I can figure out my video. Hey, there we go. So yeah, like I said, today we're starting our journey through syntax. I'll probably be doing 2 or 3 of these videos that you can be listening to this week. We'll get it done that way. Homework will be done as usual. So let's talk about where we've been and where we're going. So far in this class, we did a unit on phonetics, where we were looking at phones. We did a unit on phonology, in which we were looking at the phoneme. We just finished last week our unit on morphology, where we are looking at morphemes. And today, we're going to be doing our new unit, syntax. And what is the one question we want to ask ourselves is, what is the basic unit of syntax? What are we looking at when we're looking at syntax? You might think syntemes, that's clever, but no, in this case, syntax, we're going to be looking at the organization of words. So in morphology, we were looking at the organization of morphemes in the process of building words, the internal structure of words, you could call morphology. In syntax, we're going to be looking at the structure, how sentences are built up. And these sentences are built up of words. Words are going to be our basic unit. Like I said, we're going to be looking at how we put these things together to form sentences. For a brief diversion into typology, we looked at morphological typology last Wednesday. In syntactic typology, we see a simple fact that not all languages have the same rules for constructing sentences. Here we have some examples up on the screen now of simple word order typology. So you can look at an example like English. In this example 1, you see the sentence, I see him, where we have a subject. You can see subjects throughout these slides in red. We have a verb that shows up in blue, and we've got an object here in that purple color. So we see a basic order layout for English sentences, which are SVO, subject, verb, object. And that holds fairly true, although with some definite exceptions, which we'll be looking at later on in class. Looking at other languages, we see that even this simple pattern of subject, verb, object is not held constant. It's different based on different languages. We have an example here in sentence 2 of Japanese, where we have the subject still first in that red. Then we have the object in purple and the verb again in blue. So we have that subject, object, verb pattern, something different. And in Irish, moving on, we see a verb, subject, object pattern. You'll notice that this is only 3 options that I've listed here, SVO, SOV, and VSO, but there are more, right? For instance, there are some patterns here that are missing, like where's the VOS? Does that exist in the world's languages? And the answer to that question is essentially yes. Most of these patterns are attested somewhere, but these are the most common. And even amongst these, they're not equally created, not equally distributed. They're equally created. All languages being equally functional, of course, but they're not equally distributed as far as statistics. We find much more SVO and SOV than even VSO. SOV and SVO being quite equally represented in the world's languages. And then a sharp drop after that. We can, sorry for the noises. We can talk about why these word order patterns might be more common in the world's language when we get to a more discussion-focused section, probably in a couple weeks when we come back from spring break. That's an interesting topic of why we tend to see these ones. Is that a historical accident? Is there something cognitive going on there? These are good questions that you can be thinking about on your own and that we can discuss when we get into a discussion section. Furthermore here, with regards to word order, one last thing is that languages don't necessarily have to choose just one pattern. They can instead have variable word order. Here we see a good example from a Native American language, Ojibwe, an Algonquian language, where you see the same topics, the same meaning. All of these four sentences that you see, A, B, C, and D, they all mean that the hunter is dragging the deer. And here, these are long words, so it really helps to pay attention to the colors here. And this first, in A, you see a VOS, where you've got the verb first, drag, deer, hunter. In B, you've got SVO, much more English-like, with hunter, drag, deer, and moving on throughout them. But you notice you can switch the order of these items in any way, and it doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. That's what's important to take home here. These variable word order languages, there may be some slight semantic differences, but the overall description of what situation is happening here with a hunter dragging a deer is held constant regardless of this word order. A few other side things to note about syntax is that syntax is involved with a lot of the other domains of grammar that we've already been looking at in class, morphology, phonology, etc. And we've noted these, we've pointed to these a little bit in those other units as well, right? We've already noted things like the interactions between syntax and morphology, where you have the linguists arrived, perfectly grammatical sentence, the linguist with that singular, also perfectly grammatical. You can have the singular or the plural with the, and either one works. But if you try something like linguists arrived, perfectly good. You don't need that article there, that determiner. But if you try linguist arrived, where you have the singular form without that article, right? So you've changed the morphology in that syntactic frame, that syntactic environment, the singular doesn't work. That's an interaction between the syntax, the word order, the fact that you have words or don't have words, that also falls under the domain of syntax, interacting with a morphological element, like whether you have the plural S on the end of linguist or not. Linguists arrived, good. Linguist arrived, ungrammatical. We can also have syntax affecting meaning here. So the actual word order, unlike the Algonquian Ojibwe language we saw in English, it's possible for word order, and likely even, for word order to affect the meaning of the sentence. The simplest one, simplest example of this is when you just switch a subject and an object, right? That means something different. Amy saw aliens. This is, of course, from the movie Arrival, one of my favorites. Linguistic superhero. How can you not like that? If you have Amy saw aliens, that means something different than aliens saw Amy. That's an asymmetrical situation. Who's seeing who? And the word order there is affecting the meaning, affecting the semantics of the sentence there. Semantics being actually the topic that we'll be talking about in a couple weeks after we talk about syntax. And even further back, if you think to 2 or 3 weeks ago when we were talking about phonology, we can see that word order also plays a role in determining that prosody or that phonology. If you have a sentence like, I like Amy Adams, I like Amy Adams, you've got this kind of, let's see if I can see that, a downward trajectory of the pitch there, versus if you have something like Amy Adams, I like, Amy Adams, I like, with that rising, ascending pitch. Just that word order, that topicalization or fronting of Amy Adams can affect our prosody, affect our phonetic and phonological qualities. Okay, so we're going to talk about some basic things again. Today we're going to cover some basic aspects of syntax. And one of the things we're going to be looking at is grammaticality judgments and how these interact with syntax. A basic observation here is that we make grammaticality judgments based on syntax all the time. Right? Taking a look at example 1 here, the astronomer hit the physicist with the telescope. That sounds like a really good sentence, or maybe not a desirable sentence, but a grammatical sentence at least. But if we say something like the astronomer, the physicist with the telescope hit, those things aren't in the right order in order to be structured into a good sentence. That's a syntactic issue. I'll see if I can get that sound off. As you can imagine, there are emails flooding in like crazy during this time. you might know what the second sentence means. You might be able to piece it apart. The astronomer and the physicist are the two people here, and somebody's being hit with a telescope, but it's not the same. It's still ungrammatical syntactically, even if you can discern some sort of meaning going on in the sentence. And these, what we're pulling at or what we're asking about when we look at sentence 1 and 2 and say which one is grammatical and which one is ungrammatical, is we're looking at native speaker intuitions or speaker intuitions. It doesn't always have to be native speaker intuitions. But we're seeing that we know something about this syntactic ordering without actually knowing the rules. Maybe you learned some of these rules in something like English class in high school, but we're going to challenge some of those and see that you actually know a lot more about your language than you might think you do. And it shows itself when we ask about grammaticality judgments, like the difference between 1 and 2. And we have native speaker intuitions, or we have intuitions about the grammaticality on a bunch of different levels, right? This is in some ways a very similar process. Asking whether 1 or 2 is grammatical here is a very similar process to asking questions like we did in phonetics and phonology, whether batiln makes a good English sounding word or not. In that case, it doesn't. Or in morphology, we asked the same style of native speaker intuition question when we asked what that silly movie title, Lesbian Vampire Lover, could mean. What the morphological compounding structure there of that phrase, lesbian vampire lover, could mean. And that it can't in fact mean this meaning of a lover of lesbians who's a vampire. These are all asking about our native speaker intuitions, and we're going to be doing a lot of that with regards to syntax. It's going to divide, in fact, how we look at these native speaker intuitions is going to be in one of two camps. We can think of these as being in two schools or two camps. We're going to separate looking at syntax through attestation versus looking at syntactic studies and syntactic practices through elicitation. Two different ways of sort of observing the syntactic world. Where are we going to get our data from? That's the core question. And for the rest of that little mini lecture today, this one's probably not going to go too long, that's what we're going to be talking about. Attestation versus elicitation. Two ways of doing syntax, of getting syntactic data that we can work with, of observing how syntactic rules happen in our language day to day. So attestation is what we're going to start with. Attestation is a historical record of a phenomenon. We're looking back at past instances of language use and seeing if we can find an attested form or not. Usually what we're doing, or what we're looking at when we're dealing with attestation, is we're looking at what we're going to call corpora, the single of which is a corpus. We're looking at a corpus, some collection, a body of data, to see if we can find a particular syntactic form. So we have our corpus. This can be any sort of thing, right? A corpus could be a collection of books, like a library. It could be a collection of recordings or other written materials. It could be transcripts. It can be electronic. A lot of corpora are online these days. Google has a very famous one called the N-gram corpus, where you can search for clusters of words. So this is, oh man, you really can't see this image below it. But here in this image below, we're tracking the usage through time from the 1800s to the early 2000s of three terms. I think they're Frankenstein, Albert Einstein, and Sherlock Holmes. And so each of these little lines here that you see represents the usage, the frequency of those terms through time. Frankenstein apparently has come out on top as the most frequently used term of that trio. So what we're doing in this example is we're looking back on our written historical records, and we're just looking for these instances of word patterns, in this case names. That's what we do with the corpora. We're compiling some sort of linguistic data, and we're searching back through that linguistic data to find patterns. And we can use these sorts of attestation style studies in a bunch of different ways, in a bunch of different linguistic modes that we've been looking at over the past 5 weeks, right? So we can think of phoneticians might want to use these audio recordings. Corpora often incorporate audio recordings, and they might want to study some formant frequencies, right? We can think of our acoustic phonetics section that we had at the beginning of the quarter to see how the formant frequencies have differed over time. Phonologists themselves could use these phonetic transcriptions once you have those down, and you can look for different patterns in allophones to see if the environments, complementary or contrastive, everybody loves their phonology, has changed, or what that looks like in a large data picture. So you can often do these things looking back through time, like we looked in this engram where it was going from the 1800s to 2000s, but you can also look at within a single time slice too. It doesn't always have to be a diachronic or historical study. And a syntactician could use transcripts to observe what orders words appear in. Right? So what sorts of sentence structuring we have and which ones we don't find, right? We find a lot of that SVO, for instance, but we don't find very much VSO in English. So we can look at the transcripts, look at this attested linguistic data, and say which ones of these patterns we find and which ones we don't. So that's what attestation looks like, but there's some problems here with doing attestation, particularly for syntactic work. So one problem that we have is specificity. When we're looking back on these corpuses, we just might not find information that we want. Right? If we're looking for a very specific sentence or sentence type, depending on how much data we have, it just might not be there. Right? If you want to know about, the history of the perceptions of Poseidon during the 1300s, and you just go looking through random old data, that's very specific. You're probably just not going to find anything. And we don't know what to make of that. When you don't find something there, what does that mean? Does that mean it's ungrammatical? Or does it mean we just don't have any evidence for it? That's a problem with attestation. What does it mean if you just don't find it? That's also getting into this no negative, right? If something doesn't appear, what does it mean? It's a combination of these two. We might not have all the information we want in all the certain circumstances we wanted, or we might not have any instances, and it's tough to say what we do in those situations when we just don't find the information that we're looking for. We'll go over a brief example of this specificity and no negative data problem within syntax and phonology. We'll compare those two. I apologize, I know it's a Monday, well, depending on when I actually get this uploaded and when you listen to it, it could be a Monday. I apologize for some math. We're going to keep the math nice and simple and ballpark, so it shouldn't be too bad. So let's take an example of a study that I've seen done before. We're going to take Big Brother Season 4, and we're going to make our corpus the transcript of every word that is said during Big Brother Season 4. So we just have an audio recording. You could just watch it on YouTube or something, and we're writing down every word and who says it from this season of television. And what we come up with is a corpus of about 10 million words. This is a hypothetical situation, so we're using big round numbers for this. We've got, say, a corpus of 10 million words. It's a pretty good sizable corpus. And it's probably got something, again, we're just guessing, we're using averages here, and not even real averages, of about 40 million phonetic segments, right? 10 million words, we say there's maybe 4 segments per word in English. We got 40 million phonetic segments. Ooh, that's a lot for phonetics to work with, right? And we can say that maybe we're interested in the sounds that come at the beginning of a syllable, that syllable onset position, and what sounds we can get there. Say we have 20 million instances within this corpus of syllable onsets. Nice. It's like, if you have 2 onsets, 2 syllables per word or something, right? And us, as phonologists, are going to take these 20 million syllable onsets, and we're going to look for a very particular combination, a very particular syllable onset, a BT. Does a syllable start with BT? And if we look through these 20 million syllable onsets and we never, ever find a syllable that starts with BT, you might think to yourself, huh, we never found BT. Is that systematic? Or is that just a lack of specificity, right? Did we just happen not to find it? That's the question we want to think about. Again, we can do a little bit more math here and say that if given the sounds of English, there's about 500 possible one or two consonant onsets, right? Combinations of either just one thing or combos of two things in either order. There's 500 possibilities for onsets in English. We should observe every combination if things were distributed randomly. Of course, they're not because language isn't done randomly. But were they to be evenly distributed, where we see the same, each onset the same number of times, we would expect to see an onset about 40,000 times. 20 million, right, divided by the 500 possibilities is 40,000. So we expect to see each combination, each onset 40,000 times. We've looked for one specific onset, this BT, and found it 0 times. We might be able to say to ourselves, hey, 0 is a lot less than 40,000. Now, again, things aren't distributed randomly, but this still might make us suspicious that there's a systematic gap here, and that BT, like in that fake word, batilm, is actually not a good English onset. We expected to see it 40,000 times, give or take, and we found it 0 times. Suspicious. That's phonology, right? So attestation works pretty good when we're looking at things like that. But when we switch over to looking at syntax, things change. This is the last math, I promise. I think. So let's take a look at a syntactic example where we're looking at attestation. Here we find that average person, neurotypical adult native English speaker knows about 40,000 words ballpark. Again, we're just using ballpark figures to make a point here. So now we want to look for like a very specific sentence. How many sentences can we generate or do we generate from these 40,000 words? If we consider sentences of 2 words long, just 2-word sentences, I ran or something like that, we see we have about 1.6 billion ways to combine these 2 words. If we up that to 3-word sentences, the possibilities go up to 64 trillion 3-word sentences. And if we up it to 10 words, we get this preposterous number, right? 1.84, 10 to the 42nd, right? Just an insane number of combinatoric possibilities there. And of course, we can get sentences that are more than 10 words or all the way up to, including these, right? So if we look at our sentence of 10 million words, we'll be generous and say that's 5 million sentences. And we don't see the sentence that we're looking for. We're looking for one very specific sentence, and we don't find it in our corpus of 5 million sentences. What does that tell us? We didn't find one sentence out of our 5 million, and there's 64 trillion ways to combine 3 words. Right? We're not surprised. Right? That doesn't tell us much. We're not surprised that we didn't find an exact sentence that we're looking for. That makes it tough to do this kind of very specific work with attestation and syntax combined. Send me emails if that doesn't quite make sense. It's hard to look back for very specific syntactic things, especially when we're looking at a syntactic sentence or one specific sentence in attestation and expect to find it. The math doesn't quite check out on a Monday morning. Another problem, another side of this difference here, is that attestation, even when you find a sentence, So say we're looking for that one sentence and we find it. Does that mean that the sentence is grammatical because we have an attested instance of a sentence? And the answer is no, it doesn't, right? Even when we find a sentence attested, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's grammatical. For instance, take a look at these 4 sentences on your screen right now. Each of these are attested sentences of English. Forget about your house of cards and I'll do mine. I've been walking, pizza, pizza, me so hungry, and that's the guy that you asked me whether I knew him. All of these are attested sentences of English, and yet, for standard American English, each of these is judged by native speakers of that standard, or something close to it, to be ungrammatical, despite the fact that they're attested. Right? We say things that we also think are ungrammatical. Some are from other dialects, 1 and 2, for instance, are grammatical in different dialects of English, but not of this modern Midwest Standard English. So it's hard to differentiate there between grammatical for who. And the last 2 were in fact uttered by speakers of Standard American English, Midwest Standard American English, and yet they're still thought to be ungrammatical. They're either like being playful with language, a joke, or they're simple errors, right? We misspeak. Been doing it all throughout this video as it's my first video, right? A lot of the things that I'm actually saying don't follow simple grammatical patterns. That sentence that I just said, right, with stutters and restarts, even though these things are attested, they may not be grammatical. So attestation's hard for syntax to work with. Instead, what we're going to be looking a lot at is something that we hit on earlier in this lecture, native speaker judgments. Right, we're gonna ask people about the forms. We're interested in how people feel about the grammaticality of certain sentences, and so how are we going to get at that? We're going to get their native speaker judgments by asking them. People often don't just offer up judgments of sentences. Right? We have to go out and ask them. We have to elicit them, and this is a process called elicitation. It's the other half of these 2 different styles of research or of linguistics that we're looking at, which is attestation versus this, elicitation. And elicitation is what we've been doing in class sort of all along. Whenever I ask you about, is this grammatical or not? Does this sound good or not? Is batilne a good English word or not, right? What does the astronomer hit the telescope, the lens crafter mean? Or does that sound natural? And you say, no, these things don't sound natural. I'm eliciting judgments from you as speakers of English. So you're pretty used to that, right? And we'll see that this has advantages, right? It doesn't have to be complicated. You can just ask somebody, does this sound good or not? Does this sound grammatical or not? We'll see that it gets around that specificity issue because you're asking very targeted questions. You're asking, does this sentence that I care about sound good to you? That's a different process than wanting to know about a certain sentence and looking back through history to see if it occurs or not. It's much faster, it's often much cheaper, and it's much more targeted. However, it itself has limitations. Right? It's got limitations. The tough part about doing elicitation is that it can be hard to get a large enough data set. Right? When we're working with attestation, we have these giant 10 million or more word corpuses. It's really nice to get a lot of linguistic data, but when you're doing elicitation and you actually have to go around and ask people for their conclusions, for their judgments, we get lazy as linguists often, right? So we go around and we ask 5 of your friends whether it's grammatical or not, and then we use that as conclusive data. And there's a problem with that. It's just not enough data to make firm conclusions from. So there's a push going on right now in linguistics to sort of shore up this weakness. and to bring this alongside other sort of experimental methodology and other sciences where we actually need a big enough set of data. Excuse me. So we're actually trying to, instead of just asking like sort of 5 of your friends whether a sentence is good or not, we actually want to try and buff up and do this in a more principled way, right? Where we ask 30 or 50 or 100 people what their judgments on a sentence are. And then even that slight increase from about 5 to 30 or whatever has a really big impact on statistical significance when we're doing these data. So we have to be careful when we're doing elicitation that we're still using sort of methodological best practices here in syntax. Okay, I'm going to cut the video here. I actually don't know how long I've been talking, but for ease of upload and of viewing, I'm going to stop here. There'll probably be, like I said, 1 or 2 more videos that have to do with syntax that I'll upload during the week for you to watch, and then we'll move forward from there going after spring break. In the next couple lectures, what we're going to be doing is getting into, this was kind of our warm-up, talking about what syntax is and this difference between attestation and elicitation. That's what you should take home from this lecture. Well, you're probably already at home, but that's what you should remember from this lecture. Attestation versus elicitation and some basic ideas of syntax and how it relates to other things we've talked about in linguistics. Phonology, phonetics, morphology, etc. Starting next class, we're actually going to get into more specifics about the syntax and how we do it, what that looks like. What are these rule sets for putting sentences together with words? So cool. Thanks again for bearing with us. Just one more time, thank you as we figure out this whole new situation that we find ourselves in, as I figure out what to do with technology, and as you figure out how to best study these materials. It'll be a learning process, but we're off to a good start already on Monday here, so I expect it to go relatively smoothly. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll catch you probably fairly shortly. I'll try and upload the next one quickly. Catch you next time as we dive further into syntax. Thanks.